Well, hello and welcome to an Angling Direct Quick Bite. I'm going to talk you through one of my favourite ways to catch carp and a bit of a forgotten method in the modern day carp fishing, and that's the lift float. Now the lift float for me has caught me some very big carp. I've had carp over 35 pound. It's not just for small carp. It's a really effective and a really subtle way of fishing for carp when they're close in the margins. There's a time and a place for using 3-ounce leads, but if you've got a fish feeding really close in, you can gently lay that float next to the fish and get a bite really quickly. So I'm going to talk you through how that rig is set up. Well, although this is a very simple rig to set up, there are a few little things that I change from a normal float rig just to improve it. And the first thing I do, I put the float on between some float stops. Now I normally put 2 float stops either side of the float, just so that it doesn't slip on the line when I'm striking and playing fish. And another little edge that I do, when I put the float on itself, I like to use quite a small float because I like it to be overshotted, and I always put the float on with a float adapter because that means I can change the float really quickly, and sometimes when I'm playing fish near lily pads or reed beds, the float might get damaged, so I can change the float without having to set up from scratch all over again. And then down the main line, I don't use any split shot. I put another little float stop just above the hook, then I mould some tungsten putty round that float stop. So the float stop is just giving me something for the putty to grip to. And the reason I don't use a split shot, I feel if you pinch a split shot on your main line, it creates a weak point. And catching big carp close in on the float can be fairly heavy duty work. They scrap really hard and I want everything to be as strong as possible. Now when it comes to hook choice, well, that all depends on what bait you're using. There's a lot of different baits that can catch carp. Anything from sweet corn, bread flake, lobworms. Probably my favourite is a piece of paste, so it just adds a little bit of weight at the end of the float rig, meaning I can swing it out to the bubbles and the feeding carp nice and easy. Now the reason for using the lift float over a traditional float setup is how sensitive it is. By moulding that putty round the float stop, say 3 inches away from the hook, you want to put enough putty over that stop so that if you're not deep enough, it will pull the float under. So you actually use that piece of putty to set the depth. You want to be exactly dead depth, and then it's a super sensitive float rig. You get 2 types of bite. You get my favourite type of bite. When they pick the bait up, they lift that putty off the bottom of the lake and then the float lays flat. Or you get the normal type of bite that you get on a float when they move off with the bait and the float just disappears. Now when it comes to the hardware itself, I think one of the nicest things about catching carp on the float is even very big carp you can land on a rod of about a 2 pound or a 1.75 pound test curve, and it just makes playing them even more enjoyable. So that's exactly what I've got today. I've got an Advanta barbel rod in a 1.75 test curve. Then I put a small fixed spool reel on there, and the lake I'm fishing today, it's not very snaggy. The carp go to about 20 pound. So I've got a 10-pound main line that I fish straight through. But if you are fishing for much bigger carp, and there are a few snags and a bit more weed, you can go up to a 15-pound main line. And everything that I've used today, all the tackle, all the hardware, we'll put links to those products in the description below. And one more thing, if you want to see me catching a few carp on the lift float, I have filmed a specimen series where I catch 1 or 2 nice fish.